Finally, tonight, we return to the challenge of ISIS, but this time to a look at its beginnings. The story is told in a new book, Black Flags, The Rise of ISIS. Author Joby Warrick has covered national security and the Middle East for The Washington Post. He talked with Jeffrey Brown at this weekend's Miami Book Fair.
Welcome to you.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Could not be more current, of course. We'll get to current events, but you were in this book looking at the backstory of what led to today.
Yeah, I think to a lot of people, the ISIS seemed to come out of nowhere last year. And the truth is, there's a very long and complicated story behind this organization. It's quite different from Al-Qaeda. It always has been a different stripe, but its story goes back into, prisons in Jordan in the 1990s, and with individuals who became radicalized and became very different from this message of Al-Qaeda about sort of driving out the Western powers from the Middle East. But they wanted to create a caliphate, this powerful idea that drives ISIS. From the beginning, it was kind of something that morphed as they went along, but what the idea was to do something here and now, not worry about far enemies, not worry about the Western powers, but try to create this holy state, this holy empire.
As with Al-Qaeda, it began, though, in jails, in prisons, right? With a small core. Yeah,
that is interesting, because a lot of the founders of Al-Qaeda, as you say, Zawahiri and others, came out of Egyptian prisons.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And so the same pedigree and some of the same sort of beliefs and so the radicalization process was fairly similar.
A lot of confusion, uncertainty about its history, a lot of confusion about just what it is. How do you define ISIS?
Well, ISIS, it's interesting in that it's a group that sort of latches onto a few central themes that identify it. One is this idea of creating the caliphate as sort of the immediate and also long-term goal. This is something they want to do. And there's also this embracing of violence for its own sake. This is not strategic violence sometimes, but it's just to shock and awe or to horrify. And they use violence and they use media very deliberately to intimidate to enemies and also to excite their base, to get other radicals to join their movement and to help them.
So when we see the beheadings, of course, we see the destroying ancient sites, those are for effect.
Yeah, there's a message there. They're not trying to win hearts and minds of people around the world, and not even the Muslim community. They are looking to provoke, and that's what they're very good at doing.
How did they get from, I mean, the story you're telling is how they got from Jordan prisons to an international organization. Yeah. Was there a key moment along the way when that you can now look back and say, okay, now this is the real beginning of this group?
There's a key individual, and there's a terrorist whose name was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He was a Jordanian terrorist, a fairly minor figure, but he ends up becoming important for two reasons. One was because the United States, the Bush administration in particular, decided to make him kind of a poster child for this connection between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. So they picked on some very flimsy evidence that suggested a connection, and they actually put his picture in front of the United Nations in 2003, arguing for an invasion of Iraq. Turns out the evidence was wrong. It had nothing to do with Saddam Hussein. It had nothing to do really with Al-Qaeda, but it made him famous. It gave him a platform. Suddenly he becomes an international hero in the jihadist community, and then immediately after that, the invasion takes place. Zarqawi moves into Iraq and starts his insurgency, which really becomes the force that almost drove the U.S. to defeat in Iraq.
Well, this is a big part of the story. The actions or misactions of the U.S. and other Western governments. Were those, that kind of thing, an act of omission or commission, or how do you see it?
There's multiple acts of commission, I think, in the early days, and it was not just the invasion itself, which gives people like Zarqawi a platform and a reason to call others like him around the world to help out. But also it was a security vacuum that emerged in Iraq in the early days, where the Baathists are disbanded, the army is sent home, and so Zarqawi, this fanatic, has sort of a willing army of Iraqis ready to help him. And so together this sort of blend of fanaticism and then military and bureaucratic professionals ends up becoming this force called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and that is the core of what is now ISIS. It's the same group today.
And then stir in the Syrian civil war.
Absolutely. So actually toward the late 2000s, the Zarqawi's movement was on its heels. Zarqawi himself was killed. They were kind of driven underground. There was no real sense that they had any future. Then Arab Spring happens. Then the Syrian civil war takes place, and suddenly there's a whole new opportunity. They essentially get their rebirth in the ashes of the Syrian state.
One of the key questions now, of course, is how organized is ISIS? Who's Is it centrally run, or are these cells out there?
Well, they do have this powerful central organization. It's remarkable to me to see how good they are at things like logistics, how good they are at getting supplies and moving recruits to various places, getting suicide bombers to take on these incredible missions. But also they are very good at inspiring people in other parts of the world to kind of take up the same mantle. And we don't always know how well connected some of the local groups are to ISIS Central. Mm-hmm. But there's clearly at least some messaging through propaganda and some actual coordination as well.
Messaging through propaganda?
Yeah, so ISIS, for example, this recent Paris attack. Mm-hmm. So this individual, Aboud in Paris, who's the ringleader of the attack, mm-hmm. he gets sort of chided publicly by ISIS's propaganda ministers in Syria, saying, do something in Paris. These Westerners have to pay for the things they're doing to us. And so that becomes, we think, part of what drove him to commit this crime.
You use the word chided. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting.
Yeah, there is this.
It's not order. It's not like, why don't you chiding?
Yeah, there may be some of that too, but it feels like there's almost some shaming that goes on. And you see this repeatedly by ISIS Central and their propaganda messages. They use their videos, which they put out publicly, to call upon, jihadis in Paris, do something, do anything. And they make the same message for like-minded people in America and Russia and other places like that, kind of egging or goading local affiliates to take action.
Did anything about Paris surprise you?
You know what? We weren't totally surprised that they would lash out outside the region. Their focus has mostly been Syria and Iraq because they have their hands full right now. They're being attacked from multiple sides. Everybody's bombing them. Right. They have the Syrians and the Kurds, Syrian Arabs and Kurds coming after them on the ground.
All right, the book is Black Flags, The Rise of ISIS. Joby Warrick, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jeff.
That conversation was recorded this weekend at the Miami Book Fair. You can find more PBS coverage of the fair, including additional author interviews, at bookviewnow.org.